Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to Modulis this rainy afternoon. So we Modulis, we are not just designers and manufacturers of flooring solutions, but we want to be part and facilitate the debate and the discussions about the trends that are going to shape the future of architecture and design. And that's why during the year we organize a series of talks and workshops with industry experts, and the team has been part of that over the last few months. And what better occasion than the Clarkson World Design Week to organize a workshop with Tim Fu, architect and AI specialist, and you are here up for a treat now. He's going to talk to us about how to write and develop prompts for AI and how to use them into architectural applications. So without delay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, hello. Does this work? Hello, hello. I don't think this is working. Hello, hello. All right, we're good. All right, welcome, guys. So today's session is going to be a little bit different from the type of stuff that I usually talk about in lectures and conferences. Today, we are going to be diving a little bit deeper into the actual technical aspects of using a tool like Midjourney and how to prompt things and control it, how to use English language, for example, to derive at visuals. And it's all about control. Everyone can type something out, but to get it to where you want it, that takes a lot of a lot of studies to get really good at. So without further ado, what you guys can see, there's nothing very interesting here but a bunch of text, but this is like the full course of what I typically teach for a 2-hour session. We're going to try to condense this and give you guys the essence of what's important. So really, overall, I'm going to zoom in and out from here so you guys can see better. But we started this whole AI sort of breakthrough really came through a lot of underlying principles, one of them being neural networks. Pretty much implicit programming, black box approach to get to the results we want. And we have ideas of training data and discriminating data so that the AI can understand how to, derive a results based off of certain values that are positive or negative, how close these results are related to the text. And more recently, the phenomenon we've seen with AI video, with AI imagery, happened so in the last 2 years, and that's due to diffusion model. And diffusion model is mostly at this point pixel-based. Of course, it can also be 3D, but the idea is we're taking an image, we're kind of like sampling it down into fewer pixels and understanding the relationship of those pixels. And for example, a word like cat, if there are 6, 7 pixels, for example, they are currently rearranged in this manner so that when you bring it to complete static and then bring it back into visuals, it's going to regenerate. So for example, a cat, an astronaut, is going to go from a diffused model back to repopulate the pixels based on existing pixels. So we say, oh, if I do these pixels in this manner, it's going to fulfill the fact that it's a cat and the fact that it has it's in spacesuit, floating in space. So if those text allows the pixels to exist and fulfill those parameters, that's how we actually get the visuals. So really, that's breaking down the whole process of how that works. Now, to understand that, now we understand how to bring diffusion model into our thinking when we're prompting. So there's a lot of AI tools out there. We have principally Midjourney. Our office right now mainly uses Midjourney as one of our creative tools, alongside a few other AI tools that are more program-oriented. But then right now we have some competitions with Adobe Firefly. We have DALL-E, which is kind of never that realistic as we've tried. And we have LookX, which is quite good at doing other technical related tasks, which I will describe later. Stable Diffusion, this is one of the big players as well. They are developing rapidly. and Runway, which is good for 3D, good for video as opposed to still imagery. So this is pretty much the best out of the hundreds and thousands that exist that is currently being developed. And you can see from just Midjourney alone, I came from 2 years ago to now, this whole process of developing Midjourney, developing ideas with Midjourney. At the very beginning, we started around like end of July 2 years ago. And over the last 2 years, it just became really realistic and also really easy to control. So we're here today. That was 2023. We're in 2024 now, so even better. But if we really get into how to prompt things, this is going to be more of the workshop session now. So actually, there's a lot of things that we have to think about when we're prompting. Every single element in writing text has an effect. For example, the length of your text. For those of you that really want to get into the prompting, think about how much words you put. When you put very little words, the weight of the words are heavy. So it ends up generating a lot more consistent ideas. Here, for example, flatland, earth, desert, earth and house. And I wanted to do these like, earth and homes, but I wanted to control the morphology of it. We started adding other parameters, parametric, biomorphic. And then when you start to oversaturate with a lot of words, what you guys can see is that it's really trying to reconcile a plethora of ideas. And that's when AI has its limitations, or it's just that the design has a limitation to try to reconcile so many different ideas. So if you have something specific, more text is better, but don't go over too much. And if you want the AI to give you more creative ideas that are more holistic, you use less text. So the length is one of the factors that we play with. And another thing is that this is not like ChatGPT, and it's not like Google. Actually, it is more like Google than it is like ChatGPT. There is a very basic language model in Midjourney, so you don't use full sentences. Here's an example of us using full sentences versus just word salad, as we call it, which is the key points that you need in this particular project. Timber, Japanese, triangular, modernist, stilt house, lake reflective, Banff, mountains. These are just words. Crumble them together and they give you the same imagery as you would if you were to put a full sentence. So that's something that will help you if you just think of them as distinct concepts and words, not a full sentence. It's not like a robot you're talking to in English and it just responds. It's an algorithm. So it's not as intelligent as AGI. But chronology as well, it's not important. There's a lot of, I think, placebo effects that people come to mark as behaviors, but they don't actually exist. For example, chronology, I've tested on multiple versions. The most current version doesn't have any effects. We're scrambling around the same prompts and text, and we're getting the same results. So as equally important as it is to know what behavior can be noted down, it's also important to know what behaviors are in your mind and actually don't exist. So vague versus precise words is one of the very key aspects of how we control AI. Now here we see interesting architecture, right? Extremely prompt, very vague words, but they generate a very interesting, just like the word sakes, it generates more ideas for us. We allow the AI to provide new concepts and morphologies and approaches because we are not locking it down to a certain area of the latent space that is their database. As we start to gather more precise words, here, beautiful, contemporary, two-story villa, we start to get, more consistency of exactness that we're trying to go for. All the way until the end, we have south-facing, Usonian, contemporary, modernist bungalow. Extremely precise typology, material, and what we can see is almost like the same building repeated 4 times. So that ability to control the precision is based on the precision of your English words that you use, or whichever language that you use. Punctuations and spaces, technical things, they don't matter until you don't use any space. So here we have some funky results. And this happens if you realize you made a mistake, you had a typo, and you group some words together. But the idea is the actual, all these symbols, they all act the same. They're just like a space. So whatever you put underscore, if you put other syntaxes, it's just the same. And without going into too much details, there's a plethora of other parameters to experiment on. These ones I won't go into too much detail. There's a tile parameter that could be useful because it generates textures that's tiled so that you can use it for, rendering assets or other sorts of things. It's quite useful in our industry. But the more useful prompts, I would say, for example, is style raw. This is one of the prompts that you just add to one of the parameters that you add to the end of your sentence, and you just, these are called parameters. You just add that, like -- style raw, and then it's going to go into different territory. Now, this is quite interesting because what we need to learn now is Midjourney has a built-in stylization. It has an algorithm to drive it towards a certain style. And that typically is a little more fantasy-oriented or animation-oriented. So for example, random two words I slapped together, pneumatic tower. Here on the left, if you put too few words, the Midjourney's aesthetic really pops out and you can see it's very fantasy-like. Whereas if I just put style raw after it, it changes drastically. And how you can think about it is, if you were to Google these words, you're definitely going to get more like this type of aesthetics than this. So it's more raw to the data, right? We're not applying any sort of parameters to it. Again, for architecture, that's quite crucial because we get all these potential fantasy-like things if you put Emerald Cabin. And in reality, in our industry, we need something very realistic, photorealistic. So the cabin now becomes something that is extremely photoreal if you put that parameter after. And that applies to everything else. So sometimes you might want to include that parameter, sometimes you don't. A Corel master plan can give you something fantasy-like if you're going for that aesthetics. Maybe if you're selling to, I don't know, a project in Saudi Arabia or something like that, you could, go for that type of aesthetics. Otherwise, it's going to be completely technical. Like, if I'm looking at a master plan in the shape of corals, this is a lot more closer to what I'm really going for. So that is one of the many things that you can do to add to your prompts to change its behavior. Now, in the same discussion, we have this thing called stylize. And this is one of those things that we can really get into as well because it's quite fascinating. In stylize, it's -- or stylize. It's similar to style raw, except you have a number going from 0 to 1,000, and you have to set that number. By default, it is at 100. So without typing anything, it's already got stylization by 100. So without stylization, it has a very strange behavior. For example, this prompt is space, age, house, luxury, aerial, landscape, trees. If we don't put any stylization, it's really going to simulate the type of imagery you'd find on Google, for example. And you can see this type of aerial view is more important than the actual architecture itself. But when you start to stylize here at 50, you can see there's a drastic difference. Although visually looks similar, the architectural geometry starts to really be more refined, and we can see that it all has, it doesn't have the oddities that you see at the beginning. And as we increase that further, it's starting to become more biased towards certain type of architectural style or design. And we have to be careful with that because let's go up all the way to 500. This is what we call that typical Midjourney, output. Like every building ends up looking something like this if you put it all too high. So we always have to be careful not to put it too high. And just to demonstrate it, this is at full capacity at 1,000. Literally every prompt will end up looking like that. And you can see as well from the bottom, we have a second set of prompts. Same thing, right? Bjarke Ingels residential building by the waterfront. This thing is incredibly, I would call it photorealistic, but unrefined. You can see if you squint your eyes, it could be a photo, but it's not the type of aesthetics we're going for. So we increase the stylization, the geometry gets better, the repetition gets better, and there's a sense of architectural considerations. And there's a sense of, that render-esque quality of an ideal image as opposed to a real-life image. But everything becomes sunset in the end, everything becomes illuminated, and this is that's when you know it's too much. So also, even to note, Bjarke Ingels doesn't do these type of curves, right? This came from Midjourney. That's more representative of the type of things you would expect from, boxy Bjarke Ingels style parametric architecture. But this is just Midjourney doing its thing, just like it has with the top guy, it's doing it here as well. And we can also evaluate how that is interpreted from interior, because here we have Orientalism, timber, interior, living room design. And putting raw at 0 literally looks like, somebody took a photo of somebody's grandma's house, there is no sense of refinement, but it's absolutely realistic. So we try to balance it out. Maybe the moment you start adding a little bit of that Midjourney-esque type of texture, you start to get, ideals that you want for a magazine or for a client render. They're looking for these type of aesthetics. Right in the middle is a good balance because you're able to control your own style and have it a good quality. And if you go too much, of course, again, everything looks the same. That Midjourney-esque behavior is good to a certain extent, but then it becomes a bias, and that bias is going to become your limitation. So we don't want to go too far. It's always about the balance. Now, chaos is something that I don't see many people use often, but I use it a lot in my generations. Chaos is a parameter going from 0 to 100. Default is at 0. So what that does is it just generates some, you can literally call it craziness, generate a little bit of happy accidents, as we can call it. Basically, everything will follow exactly according to your prompt, but the moment you start adding chaos, as you see here, the view angle might change, the time of day might diversify, the architectural expressions might become more rich, and when you pump it up all the way to max, it stops following your prompts, so then it becomes then harder to control. So again, it's a balance, and the sweet spot for me is about 15 to 20%. And yeah, it's a very technical number, but that's pretty much almost always what we use when we're prompting for office projects. Again, same idea is displayed for Bjarke Ingels and then the interior as well. As you guys can see, at the very end, Bjarke Ingels, we have cyclists, and then we have architecture that doesn't relate at all the way to the interiors. You can see when it gets too chaotic, it's just completely departs from what we're looking for. However, sometimes we do that just to see what's available. So it's kind of like instead of going on Pinterest, this is like a very controlled version of Pinterest. Like we could say, I want interior made out of timber. And instead of just going on Google Images, we're getting ideas from here. And sometimes really good ideas do come from this process. And it's just the fact that we can control how much chaos we want in every single generation. And throughout this process of architectural exploration, we want a little chaos at the beginning. We thrive on it. The variety that it provides us is what empowers us to then make decisions faster and more accurately. And that, I think, is one of the key things in the age of AI, is we are now, enriched by this abundance that we have. Same thing with the control of aspect ratio. It actually has an effect on the physical architecture. If you do horizontal landscape, we end up getting more horizontal images or horizontal buildings. And as you make it more vertical, you start to generate vertical buildings. And these are all using the same prompts. Some people might have not discovered this, but yeah, you can control your architectural typology and its proportions literally just from the frame, the aspect ratio. So that's quite useful. If you're doing a super thin, tall building, you can do a very extreme vertical type of aspect ratio. Now, I won't get into these too much, but in essence is just about balancing ideas. I think it's more important for us to talk about image prompting. This one is very paramount for us because when we get to an idea, an image represents much closer to our idea than words ever will. And it's a lot more accurate to be able to, generate things from images. Now in Midjourney, we can input images as well as text and then parameters. And the weights are 50-50, right? If you have both, they're all 50-50 weighted. For example, here is a example of using text prompts, something very contrasting. The text prompt here, I put a sculptural parametric polished wood chair, and then on the image prompts, we have a villa. So they're very different things. So let's see what happens, right? If we put pure text, this is the results that it gave us. And when we put image weight at 0.5, whereas the max image weight is 2, so we start to see essence of the villa coming in, but still mostly a chair. And then at 50, is this a 50-50? Yes. At 50-50, it's kind of chaotic. It doesn't know what it wants to be. And then at 1.5, it just snaps and it knows it wants to be a villa with a chair in front of it. Like, it's starting to reconcile these ideas. And AI doesn't know how you want your idea, so you kind of just balance the scale and see how much, at what sweet spot does the AI provide the right balance of the two ideas. Here is at villa at 2, meaning that it's mostly a villa, but here's a chair anyways, right? So that's something that we can really balance. And with the visuals is how we go through our architectural design process. A lot of the times we would, in our office, render things in 3D, and then we would take those back into Midjourney, and we would use the visuals at 100% just to then get a little bit of variation using Midjourney. So that process goes back and forth. And another thing that we discovered that I think should be mentioned is latent space and understanding of latent space connections, because it doesn't just, the AI is trained on thousands of data, there's pre-trained behaviors. It doesn't just give you what you input. It gives you a kind of a cohesive result that is the best representation of both of those things. For example, Exhibit A. We've only inputted 2 images here. It looks like a model on a table, and it looks like an exterior shot of a building. Now, I wanted to see how that works, but when it gave us a result purely from these 2 images, it was like displaying a balcony. I never prompted that into existence. But we can understand now why that is because it's reconciling the fact that there are these angles, right? And it's reconciling the fact that there are an exterior with like sky and views. So it feels that in its own database, these balcony images actually covers the fact that it has this and it has that. So we need to understand is that it doesn't just prompt what you put, it prompts from its own database of pre-trained data. So it's going to bring things into existence that you haven't even prompted. And that's also quite interesting because we're not just bound by our input. So the whole process is a bit like alchemy. We kind of have to figure out what the AI will generate based on what we put. Here's another strange one. I put 2 of the same facade at different angles, but what comes out is a new series of facades. So that's interesting to see. We have a database of different things, and it's always going to give us something a bit different than the input. So another concept is what we call it the weights of the text. Every text has the same weight until you manipulate it. So this symbol over here, I guess it's 2 colons, and it applies a hard break. If you have a full sentence and you apply that, it means everything on the left of this break is weighted as 50%. Everything on the right is weighted as 50%. Take, for example, cinematic still shot 50 millimeter, vertical, tall, multi-story, blah, blah, blah. And at the very end have the word Zaha Hadid. So we know what Zaha Hadid buildings look like. Not very much like this, right? We want curvilinearity. But Zaha Hadid is only like 5 or 10% of the text. So all we did here is to just add that hard break, and that immediately changes Zaha Hadid to 50% of weight and everything else 50% of the weight. So now they're 50-50. And as you guys can see right away, the visuals is still got all the beautiful camera cinematic features we're looking for, but now the architecture of Zaha Hadid, we can see it a lot more apparent. So use these to your benefit, and you can use multiple breaks. I have 3 main concepts. One of my concepts has a lot of words I need to use because it's very precise. One of my concepts is very broad, like interesting architecture. So you have all those separate partition ideas, and you could keep them partitioned as you're going through this process of exploration. And of course, image and prompt weights as well, right? You also have images, which also acts as weight, and by default, as I mentioned, is a weight of 1. When you put these 2 things together, it's going to give you a weight of 50-50. Here is an example of only putting these 2 images and no words, and therefore each of them is 50-50, and you can see it really reconciles these 2 images very well. And here's something funny too, because the moment I added a dot at the end of it, some people might do this by accident, and they're like, oh, why do I see a face? This happens sometimes, and it's because now that dot is weighted 50, and it's generating just chaos for you. So therefore, that became this. Yeah, this type of stuff that happens all the time. So when you put 2 little words in Midjourney, chaos just results. So the approach to design is a very visual approach if you are proactive in designing with the design thinking in mind, right? If you're typing a whole bunch of words together, instead of treating it like ChatGPT and just expecting a result, we ask everybody to think through your text as if you're Googling them on Google Images in chunks. So you're visualizing as you're going along, right? Here, beautiful Banff Lake. I'm doing like first of all, the overall scene, and I know what type of images will come out, and then what type of floating house I want, and the detail of the house. I have to, sometimes I even prompt them separately just to see if these are the correct prompts on a local scale, so that I add it to the rest. Some details and some architectural photography. And so all of these ideas are separate instances of visuals in which we now have to mentally imagine them cohesing together into a final image. So if you're very proactive in this whole process of using things like Midjourney, then you actually will feel you're using a lot of creative power. Like your creative part of your brain gets really tired really fast, contrary to what people would say who just think that AI has no creativity and you're just typing something in, right? It's like a camera. If you give it to someone with no creativity, they're going to point and click. But if you're an artist, you take the tool, you're going to be able to find art within it. So yeah, other things, simple things. Avoid double meaning words like a crane standing in a forest, right? It could be a crane, but a crane. So why don't you just put a construction crane, specify it. Monkey wrench, here's a couple of monkeys. And the color could be rose color, spring, but actually it's a rose and that's actually a spring. Metal spring coil. Just specify your words and then you avoid those issues. One of the things that we always try to accomplish in architectural renders is realism. There are a lot of words and directions that we can go into for photorealism. Obviously, if you understand a bit of photography, that really helps. Words like DSLR would definitely help with the results. And this is probably not the best instance to show how realistic these are because they're quite detailed. But if you add the word photography, it helps. Cinematic still shots give you that, ethereal look. 50 millimeter, I use it sometimes, but it gets out of focus at other times. And then you have wide angle. And another interesting thing is your favorite film, like interstellar film shot. You can actually prompt a lot of film aesthetics directly into your visual results. And I found that to be quite useful because films often have a consistent frame by frame in which that becomes a database that you're able to actually use to prompt a specific aesthetics. National Geographic, for example, television channels, if you have something very nature-oriented that you think can boost the landscape around the building, drone shots, Steve McCurry. So actually photographers too, by the way. Famous photographers that you evaluate style, you can prompt it out, and photographers are very consistent in their style. So that's also a good thing to have. And one thing to mention is also placebos, because from other people's prompt, I always see a lot of words that don't do anything. Like these two prompts are pretty similar, other than the sky, but there's a lot of people that like to put the word like award-winning, 8K, ultra clear, high definition, high octane, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we've seen a lot of people prompt with those words. They actually don't do anything, and we test them multiple times. So if you want to think something works or not, test it yourself. Do it without and then do it with. Don't start your prompting process by imagining, oh, I think these are all going to work. Let's all put it together and see what comes up. Do it step by step, word by word. See which words actually give you something and which words don't. And that way, the less words you have, the easier it is for you to control your prompts. And a lot of people have very long prompts, and they wonder why it's so hard to control. Methods of reinforcing certain things, it used to work better on the old version, where I would if I need more timber, I just put timber, 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 and then it's just gonna come with more timber. Nowadays, the algorithm has shifted, so we're trying to figure out what is the best way. Using associated words, for example, here, oak, wood, Japanese carpentry, similar words that also prompt, what we call neighbor words in the latent space. And also, again, hard break. Of course, using a hard break is going to emphasize the weight of timber. And also, something quite important that we end up doing is getting rid of conflicting words. That's actually more powerful. Like here, the moment I got rid of the word white or concrete or limestone, but keeping all the rest the same, it became much more timber. So we have to understand there's a lot of words that are conflicting, in fact. And so to be able to get what you want, you have to distinguish how these words work with each other. It's almost like a company with employees. They all gotta have synergy. Some words don't have synergy. And then we just have to get rid of them. Now, things that we think about when we're designing, one of them is composition. And we value this very highly. There's a lot of ways to prompt things into existence. And one of them is to describe it, whether you want a central view, frontal view, and sometimes is using the visuals. We always make sure that the image inputs are consistent in the views. I find that to help a lot in the results. And of course, in the same conversation, we have technical parameters like zooming and panning that is already built into this version of Midjourney, which is quite helpful because we can start to reframe things. We could change the aspect ratio. There's all these technical things that you guys can read in detail once you look up on our official website. But I'm just going to give you guys an overview that these things exist. And also some of the techniques that we use. For example, we like to explore facades in detail. Like we prompt the facades as a zoomed in because it's a lot easier to control if you're prompting it from a zoomed in perspective. And once we perfect the facade, we can then just ask the AI to zoom out. And then it imagines the rest of the building. So this is a kind of like an interesting reverse strategy to go from detailed to general. Because sometimes you have a very specific sort of envelope system or facade system in mind, and then you just want to see how it looks like in certain urban contexts. So we do this reversal sometimes where we detail the facade before we go general. And of course, visual aesthetics, this is things that you more so teach to my students at Parametric Architecture Academy to think about. But obviously this applies to everything. Just visual-wise, color, you don't want it to be either too monotone or too saturated. Brightness, there's about exposure level. Sometimes things can be overexposed. And having good visual input is one of the best ways to keep it good visuals. And of course, there's always talking about what words are very CGI and what words are very photorealistic. For example, Nat Geo is a very realistic word. Urban development, and then sometimes that gives you CGI. So you do have to see which words and its associated words are related to particular, domain. And then everything else is more so design oriented. Like I think about sometimes talk about order and disorder, how we use AI to create disorder, but purposeful disorder, how sometimes there are just AI disorders that we don't want. And of course, how using AI we create seriality and order from these crazy geometries so that we can bring it into architecture. And of course, material tectonics is important too. Like how original is your tectonic, or are you just kind of regurgitating another version of something, And I think it's important to be able to be creative still when you are using AI. And I don't like to see these type of boxes a lot of the time, so I tell the students like it's the first thing to avoid. So another thing that's quite interesting is prompting exactness. I had this idea to put Van Gogh's Starry Night as a bedroom interior, and just to show you guys, like these are more so the results, and it's quite quite a nice scene to be lit up at night to see that. So in order to do that, I had to kind of bypass some of the restrictions. Like you cannot prompt two images that are the same. So what I did is I kind of edited the original image a bit, and then I put two of them back in here. So when you have multiple of the same images, it's able to actually follow the composition. Because if I prompt Starry Night without the image, as an example, this is actually what we get, right? It's quite nice, but it wasn't what I had in my mind. I didn't want it to be a background pattern. I want it to be part of the scene. So I had to prompt multiple versions of that image in place so that it gives me this instead. So it's a bit harder to get, but the moment I do it, I add, Starry Night and then some sort of bedroom image, we would then get something more so like that, which is what I had in my mind. So that's one way to what we call prompt, kind of like the position exactness, the compositional exactness. And of course, there's always remix mode as well. So the next thing when you have the right prompts, you can explore how to remix things. And this part is quite interesting too, because it now introduces an iterative process to this architectural exploration. Once you get some ideas of what you want, for example, here's this image on the left, I could vary it strongly by just clicking on strong vary, and then it's gonna give kind of like alternate organizations of the same typology and material and visual aesthetics. And if I do very subtle, it's going to do that, but at a much more minute scale. So just subtle variation, like re-diffusing at the later stage. And on top of this, we can also remix. So when we have an existing thing and we actually can edit the prompt. So for example, here I changed from like a Libeskind looking thing to Zaha Hadid Hotel. That way you can see how different it can get. So, it captures the similar aesthetics, but now we have this new type of geometry that's now negotiating with the angularity of the first one. So for example, some use cases, I find a lot of Zaha Hadid prompts to be too, curvy and cloud-like. Sometimes I want that angularity, so we actually start with something like Libeskind, just to get a strong definition, and then we soften it up with other prompts like Zaha Hadid, for example. And here's another version of it, using very subtle and remix subtle. So now it's keeping almost 100% of the original composition of the first architect, but the detailing of the second architect, right? So think about at which phase do you want which architectural expression, and you can prompt either the specific architect or just general the direction that you want. And that's quite useful now, because now we're able to generate a plethora of options, and we can see how, while capturing the original geometry, how details can be expressed differently. And of course, these can also be studies that goes directly to the client, and they can see what alternatives we can have on a overall massing that's already fixed. Now, another thing that is very useful is varying locally. Like in this particular instance now with Midjourney, we can select just a certain area and make adjustments. I'm sure many of you who have been using Midjourney are using this quite frequently, because this is definitely one of the most useful features to have. But those of you that don't know, we are able to select different regions and vary. So more like a typical architectural process where we have a result, we want to finesse some corners, some details, we select it and we just push it forward. And you're selecting the detail, you can actually describe it, right? So I want this door to be wood, to be curvy or whatever. And it's actually a step-by-step process now. Meaning we can go element by element of this architecture and fix things. So the other things I think are less important, because here is just me trying to figure out how to, start with a logo. For example, here's a Mitsubishi, and I wanted to bring it into a house. So we just changed the prompt from a logo into a house, and you just keep evolving it, just like the process that I've mentioned, until you get to the final result. So this is a showcase to show you how we can actually control first the overall geometry and then the detail expression. And they should always follow that order. Outside of that, sketching also helps, but there's now more powerful tools that goes from sketch to AI. So I will talk about something like LookX. I would not recommend using Midjourney from converting one sketch to a visual, because it doesn't follow it precisely, and it's an iterative process just like you see here. But what I will show you is how we use LookX to do it instead, which is a lot more accurate. So again, here's the workflow. I don't know if you guys can see it very clearly. Text prompt is your first exploration. And then automatically you have a whole set of things you can do. You can test stylization and chaos, and that can then derive at a whole series of experiments, because each of those number values can change. You could do a prompt like this, and it's going to give you 3 different generations for stylization. And if you put, for example, 3 different or 4 different categories for chaos, it's going to permutate. It's going to multiply 3 by 4, ultimately giving you 12 explorations. And from test raw, style raw, that's another factor that you can bring into your matrix of studies. So all these things kind of multiply. You have text, image, prompt weights as well. When you play around with those, we always study them in parallel, so we develop a lot of matrices in our office when we study things. And that goes to show how complex it can get with just a few parameters. Variation as well, as I've showcased, you can vary things subtly, or you can remix. You can upscale it to the max, and then do the remix again. And there's a whole, array of things you can do before you even get to post-processing. So where are we at now? What we can do is start with the Midjourney process of typing in the words, testing it out using the methods I've described, and you try to come up with a bigger array of results so that you can actually know the behavior. Like, don't just generate it once and say, oh, these are the good prompts. Actually, every prompt you generate quite a few times so that you get the full breadth of what each of the prompts can deliver. Once you have the prompt that gives you the best results, that is where you then select the decision of which direction you want to go. Now, once you have that, you can then vary it, as I've discussed. So for this particular project, it was a villa that we're trying to look at. And once we vary it to a certain extent, we approach a more finalized results. Here's a few variations that we've done. And each of them has that sort of distinct aesthetics that we were looking for. But then we found one that was quite appealing to us. And so this is where we are at the final results. And using local variation, we can then further improve and refine our form. So we already have this general idea. I said, okay, it's an S shape, and then I want this whole thing to flow down with a staircase. It's a beautiful concept, but it needs to be executed better. So we select, areas that needs to be improved. Like there's getting rid of artifacts, there's improving the way the stairs flows with the wall, and reprompting it until we get the results we want. There's ideas of the corners, how it's messy, and we find, out of the 10, 20 different ways that this corner can be resolved, we find the best one and we deploy that. And we get rid of, little hacks and stuff and that shouldn't be there. We get rid of messy corners, we round the corners. So really, it is a very iterative process at the end of being very picky with your results. So if you're the architect, you're the designer, you should have a very perfectionist sort of mentality, right? As architects and designers, we all have that. And that's why we keep trying to pushing something towards what we want. And now AI is part of that process. If you are picky, you're going to do something better with more time. So it doesn't even stop after Midjourney. You still have a lot of things you can do post-process. Some of our process includes compositing multiple versions of the results on Photoshop and then picking the certain areas that we like for each of them and then further compositing it. So this is really like a good photographer that is getting a few good shots and still going back on Photoshop. And if you ask any photographer, they'll tell you how much time they spend on Photoshop, post-processing things, because it can always be better. And that also applies both with aesthetics results as well as details. And ironically, AI has never left the process. Now with Photoshop, we have AI fill, and that further fixes things. For example, here we have I wanted to really represent that curved edge of the window, so I needed to get rid of that little column stub over there. And for this case, I wanted to have a cleaner result as an interior space. So we just do those little design decisions and just let AI fill it up. We know where it lacks, and we can use AI to continue pushing it even after when you're in Photoshop. So with Photoshop and with AI, there's now a lot of opportunities to do different interesting things, especially with real life images. Here's an example of a concept design that we did with AI, and here is a site photo. And compositing it together, what we can do is actually, take the AI image and the site photo into the layer, deleting the area around it, and then letting the AI fill it up again. So in a way, you're just using AI to transfer a simulated visual results of a building into a real area. And now that is really useful because now we can just juxtapose our little designs and ideas anywhere in every corner of real life. So that's immediately helpful for us. And more technical things, if you guys really want to get into Midjourney and really want to have good results, I recommend you set up a private server with Discord. This means that you invite the AI tool into your server, and then this way you can categorize your projects onto different sections. And because AI will use a lot of visual input, you can also organize your inputs. So for interior spaces, for fluid spaces, for exterior, something maybe gothic, urban, I categorize my image inputs as well. So it's a sense of organization, and I'm able to prompt directly by taking it by querying it from my own database. So it's quite useful to have in an organizational sense. The other things I think are rather technical, so we don't have to get into that. But overall, we have to understand what Midjourney is, and it has a database. It is not Google Images. It's called the Lion 400 million open data set, published in 2021. And these are important to know because a while ago I was trying to prompt the Galaxy Soho and the Lisa Soho, which are two projects at Zaha Hadid where I worked. but one of them just doesn't get prompted. For example, the Lisa Soho one is this, vertical atrium building, and it doesn't come out. What comes out is is rather the other Zaha stuff. So just by going to ClipFront, if you Google ClipFront, it is a search algorithm that specifically searches the Lion dataset. So from here, what I can see is if I search the Galaxy Soho in Beijing, I get these results. This is the actual data used by Midjourney. Down here is the Lisa Soho Beijing, which doesn't have what I was looking for. So now I understand why it's not prompting what I want. So this is quite useful to know, because instead of guessing what images are actually you're using to train, you're actually able to search it yourself and see what images you do prompt out in the search results. So it demystifies this whole process for you. And of course, once we're done with the visuals, you can further improve it by using upscale algorithms. This one is quite useful as well, and we use it almost for every result. You have, either Magnific or Krea, and these apps they give you free credits every day too, so you can just go ahead and use it. This is what happens when you scale things up. I don't know if it's very easy to see, but you can see the quality difference, right? The way that the pillow is, or the way that the wall details are. You can see the results of how much the upscaler improves our image. Here's one using this thing called the EsserGAN. It's another type of algorithm, and you can see that not only does it improve pixels, it hallucinates details for us, including panel edges and seams. So as we can see, that has become really helpful in our process. And we use different upscalers for different purposes. Here is the upscale workflow. We go from Midjourney images at around 1,500 to Krea going all the way up to 2,000, because Krea adds creative details. And then we use other type of GANs, either EsserGAN at this point, or currently I would recommend Magnific, as it's absolutely the best in the industry so far. And we upscale it to, upwards to 5,000 pixels. And I've done a few magazine covers already, and this is the process that we use. And you can really get that level of detail for even magazine publishing. So yeah, in architecture, this is where we want to go. How to bring it to 3D. The next step is to talk about how to go from an AI visual to understanding how for example, using Rhino and SubD, we're trying to figure out what is the underlying structure. And using that panelization, we're able to further improve the details by using things like Grasshopper, parametric algorithms, to develop the details using just algorithms and structural behaviors. So we're able to simulate a results in 3D by the use of these tools. Now finally, what I mentioned before that I skipped was the sketching thing. We have LookX, right? LookX is a AI platform that is specifically trained on architectural data. So what it does is it's really able to give you results that look like some of the things that you would see in architectural data sets. And I've done this particular one that was quite circulating. I just crumble a piece of paper and I prompted Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid and then Daniel Libeskind to work on the physical model. And you guys can see the level of detail that already exists from a crumpled piece of paper to such a detailed model, also reconciling all the landscapes with a similar architect style as well. It has just become an incredible process to explore. So those of you that are interested, LookX is an interesting tool because you could take ideas from nature, maybe flowers. You can take basic geometries and find out how AI will enrich it for you. And finally, how you can use it for rendering as well. And that's the next step, because now we're able to render things in 3D using a 3D model, which is going to be a lot more useful for us in the later stages of architecture. And final thing is, with AI, I've managed to also jump outside of architecture and go into things like product design. Like we worked on this project with Sprayground to, develop futuristic backpacks, for example, and luggage sets. And then I've also branched into furniture design as well with this Italian furniture company to go from AI simulated images to ergonomic studies to all the way developing a 3D model. And really, it's about where it's shifting. Right now, ideas goes to sketches, goes to 3D model, but now the ideas can all be part of the AI process. Whereas technology, we're always invited to the later stages of architecture. So we're starting to see ideas being manipulated as a process. Next steps is 3D modeling, how AI is gonna, really dive into that space. And we're starting to see early signs of that. Maybe the video AIs we see with OpenAI Sora, Runway, all the way to the 3D AI in its early stages, populating point clouds based on your visuals, or generating 3D assets for video games. We've seen that as well. But really is how we can use AI further in the later stages to construction and to rendering that I think is going to change further how we practice as an industry. So yeah, with that being said, I do have courses as well that is currently, it's still on Midjourney. It's on Parametric Academy, Parametric Architecture Academy, for those of you that's interested in either my course or my fellow cohorts that are also AI professionals. Also, there's publications for those of you who want to go on my website, timfu.com. And I will be giving future talks. If you follow me on Instagram or LinkedIn, I will be there as well. So I think that about concludes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for this very interesting insights in what AI can do and see how AI is becoming part of the design process. I would like to thank you for this very interesting talk. I don't know if there are any more questions from the audience. If so, then please, this is the moment. Don't be shy, I'm sure there are some questions.
I sell it, so I don't think I'm allowed to distribute it.
Seems to be there are not so many questions. It was very clear. So if there are no further questions, thank you for coming over in our modular showroom. Please enjoy the rest of the Clerkenwell Design Week. Tim,
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Interesting talk.
Thank you.